So it's been a few days since my last video on the Thorns Minions Necromancer, and I've since made a few updates and improvements to further optimize the build. And not only that, but as I've pushed further into the endgame and especially at higher levels of the pit, I've come to realize some of the major strengths as well as limitations of the build, which I will fully cover in this video too. Now real quick before we start, if you'd like to learn more about the specifics of how exactly this build works, be sure to check out my previous video which I'll link in the description box below, which will cover the Thorns Minions build in a lot more detail. For today, I will still go over the entire build, but in a much more concise manner, and especially focusing on some of the updates I've made since my previous guide. Now, having tested Thorns Minions much more, what do I think about the viability, the niche, and strengths of this build? And first of all, I think this build absolutely kills it when it comes to farming pretty much anything in the game, even the highest level of pit materials, with even more ease in my opinion than your current meta S tier Shadow Necromancer or Shadow Minions Necromancer or Golemmancer. I think it actually does the farming aspect of it even better, albeit the absolute high tier pushing might be somewhat weaker than those aforementioned builds. But how much does that actually matter anyway, right? Unless you're like the most competitive player, you don't really gain that much in terms of rewards from pushing to the highest tier as possible, right? And so I think in terms of farming efficiency, the ease of playing this build with how safe it is by having Blood Mist as well as the Bone Golem taunt, I can effectively alternate between the two, even in relatively high level pits, and at least before the boss, have an extremely safe run. And once you get used to this rotation, you'll almost be able to essentially chill your way through even pit farming, and of course in easier content like Hell Tides, you're absolutely face rolling while farming just a ton of legendaries and just having a good chance of getting greater affixes just from farming Hell Tides too. But again, if we're purely talking about pit pushing, this build might fall a little bit short of the absolutely best builds for the Necro, although if you do use the Elixir of Holy Bolts, you'll still be very close behind, if not about equal to those builds, in my opinion, or in my experience at least. As you can see, even without using the Elixir of Holy Bolts, this build can still quite hold its own in relatively difficult layers of the pit. Although of course with the Elixir things are significantly easier, but that's true for I think most if not all builds right now. But this build is definitely quite strong for just clearing monsters in general. And again, I think this build actually does better than the top boss pushing builds in terms of the bar filling portion of the pits, right? Which is killing the monsters before the boss. Because again of how safe it is, being able to have at least one of your cooldowns usually being your Blood Mist or your Bone Golem taunt, which by the way is a huge AoE taunt, keeping you extremely safe, and while still dishing out a lot of damage through your Thorns and Needle Flare aspect, and also your Corpse Explosions from using the Blood Mist through the aspect of Explosive Mist, triggering Corpse Explosion, and also triggering more Shadow Blight that way, right? When it comes to the bosses though, and I actually think there's a chance that this might be rebalanced in an upcoming patch, perhaps the mid-season patch, but I actually think the pit has a high chance of being tuned and it's sort of balanced out of whack, as in the bosses are significantly more punishing I suppose than the first part of the run, as a lot of the mechanics will pretty much just one-shot you, and if you don't pull some kind of cheesy tactic such as using the Elixir of Holy Bolts, right? Which, again, if you do use the Elixir with this build, you'll still be able to push quite high as long as you're able to get the stars to align, right? To proc those bolts and then just like two-shot the boss, similar to how some of the other Summoner Necromancer builds have been working, or the other way that people have been pushing higher with Necromancer is with getting, again, the stars to align with all the buffs happening at the same time, and also using the Blood Golem to dish out massive bursts of damage to the boss, right? Personally, at least, I'm not really down for this type of gameplay and this type of optimization. I just don't find it that fun, and I can understand and fully respect that people that might want to use this type of strategy to push to higher levels of the pit, but it's not really for me, and thus a mix of my own personal preference and how I like to play, as well as a bit of the limitations of the Thorns Necromancer being a bit weaker against bosses, makes me feel like I'm kind of hitting a bit of a, at least pit pushing wall with this build. But again, taking a quick step back, I'm really enjoying the game, playing the Thorns Minions Necromancer. It's a super chill playstyle, especially if you want to just farm stuff. Again, even the highest level pit materials, the tier 3 materials, are an easy farm, especially even if you're just watching a video on the side with this build, which I love. And going on to the skill overview, and especially the updates I've made since my last video, again, it is pretty standard Shadow Minions build, but I've actually made some significant changes from last time. So if you look down at the bottom especially, I've spec'd out of Bone Storm, and thus on my gear I am also no longer using Shielding Storm or the Ultimate Darkness, which kind of frees up 2 aspects for me. And with that, I've swapped over to Army of the Dead while running the aspect of, or Unyielding Commanders aspect, to get another sort of burst damage option with my Army of the Dead. And one main reason for not using Bone Storm anymore is that even with Shielding Storm, with the barrier that it generates and a damage reduction from having Bone Storm active, I'm still getting pretty much or close to one shot by some of the boss mechanics at the higher tiers of the pit. So it doesn't really help anymore. And if I just use Explosive Mist with Blood Mist and lowering my cooldown on my Blood Mist especially, I can actually alternate my Blood Mist with my Bone Golem Taunt to basically be untouchable throughout the majority of the run, right? Save for, again, the boss where there are mechanics where I can't simply just use Taunt to distract from. And for the rest of the skill tree, it is, I think, mostly the same. I have Blight with Supernatural Blight for another multiplier. Here I still have Hued Flesh to generate more corpses. Corpse Explosion is the addition from my last version. Even though it's not on my bar, I am able to utilize Corpse Explosion from using my Blood Mist to trigger it with the aspect of Explosive Mist. And again, still Blood Mist is maxed for the lower cooldown, and it also leaves behind a corpse while it's being casted with Ghastly Blood Mist. The other stuff is standard and same as before: Spiked Armor, Skeletal Mage Mastery. I took 1 point out of Grim Harvest, and I still have Fueled by Death maxed out. I also took a point out of Death's Approach, especially for the higher levels of the pit, but you can totally put points back in from, say, Blood Mist if you're doing like easy speed farming content. And in addition to that, you can also put points into Reaper's Pursuit, also probably from, say, Blood Mist or from Necrotic Carapace if you don't need as much survivability, which I also took a point out of for this version as well. And here, this is standard stuff: Decrepify, Abhor Decrepify, Amplify Damage, Death's Embrace, Skeletal Mage Mastery. And then down below, I already went over this zone where I only have 2 points in Necrotic Carapace. Again, I am not running Corpse Tendrils because this build does not want to crowd control enemies as much to be able to utilize Thorns, save for the Taunt, in which case, with the Taunt, you are still dealing Thorns damage, right? Because the damage is redirected to your Golem. And next, this is still the same except for the aforementioned Bone Storm being replaced by Army of the Dead. And last but not least, I have Shadow Blight as my key passive. For my Book of the Dead, it's still exactly the same and very standard. Reapers with the corpse spawning, which is actually bugged and lowers cooldowns. And then Shadow Mages with the first upgrade to increase damage. The Bone Golem with the taunt, or the vulnerable option rather. I also did test out the Blood Golem, both upgrades, although it might have increased my bossing viability a little bit. I still actually really like the safety of the Bone Golem throughout the majority of the run pre-boss, right? And again, I don't really feel like sort of cheesing my way through the latter stages of the pit or the higher levels of the pit just through like massive lining up buffs, golem, burst damage. I feel like there's gonna be some tuning coming to the pits, and it's just not something that I really want to chase. Onto my Paragon board, it is nearly the same as before too. And by the way, in addition to my previous video that you can check out linked below, I also have my actual character template that you can refer to too. But anyhow, some of the main changes that I made, and these are very minor ones, is I took out the this cluster here on the Bone Graft board with maximum life. So I took out some of these maximum life bonuses, although I'm still not sure whether that is, you know, the optimal choice. But because I was getting one shot by a lot of boss mechanics anyway, even with like Bone Storm and the barrier, I thought I'd just take out max life and sort of deprioritize that a little bit. Although I have like 20k life, nothing great. My gear is only like stage 7 and 8 masterwork, so there's still quite a bit of room to grow. If I get more life rolls and higher life rolls on my gear, I might consider speccing back to this. But currently, I've actually taken those points out and put them into more golem damage. Namely, here I have just 2 points to grab a little bit of extra additive golem damage, And then over here on, of course, the Hulking Monstrosity board, which is like the Golem damage board, which by the way also have the Golem glyph socketed. I've extended this part out here to pick up Frenzied Golem, the node here, for extra Golem attack speed. More than 20% Golem attack speed, and again a little bit more additive Golem damage. Which my idea is to just rely more on mechanics and blood mist to stay alive, especially in bosses, and just have a little bit more damage that way. Aside from that, for the general strategy for the Paragon board, you again just want to stretch out as many points to pick up 7 different glyphs. That's basically it, while picking up the multiplicative nodes, right? And I may as well go over those nodes and glyphs, starting with Cult Leader, which increases minion damage, Hulking Monstrosity for the Golem. Moving on, we have Flesh Eater and Scent of Death. For the glyphs, I have Amplify, Dead Razor, Golem, Essence, Scourge, Exploit, and Territorial. Now, of these, Territorial, as well as perhaps Essence, since your Thorns don't crit, could potentially be replaced with something like Gravekeeper or Corporeal, especially if you're speed farming because it gives you movement speed as well, or Revenge, since you are using Thorns, and this is the Thorns glyph. Onto my gear now, I have made a few significant changes. Starting with my weapon, I swapped from one-hander offhand over to a two-hander, a slice specifically, because it swings slower and has higher damage per hit, and thus more burst damage theoretically. And I did have greater affixes on it, but I ended up breaking 2 of them with tempering, so that was really sad. But anyhow, the affixes are int, max life, crit damage. The tempering is minion attack speed and damage to cursed enemies, quite standard. For my aspect, I have blighted for the huge damage buff, which you would again ideally try to line up with your other buffs or temporary buffs for massive bursts. So for some of the other aspects I've changed, I used to have ultimate shadow as another aspect to turn Bone Storm into a shadow skill and deal extra shadow damage. But of course, since I'm not running Bone Storm anymore, I can basically remove that one aspect. And then since I'm also running Army of the Dead now, instead of Bone Storm, I am now running the Unyielding Commander's aspect for some additional burst damage with Army of the Dead. Aside from that, I also swapped out Shielding Storm, as I mentioned before, for the Explosive Mist, for my Blood Mist to have even lower cooldown, and also be able to cast Corpse Explosion without it even being on my bar for more Shadow Blight procs, and that's been working out really well. Just really quick for an overview of my gear in general. Again, I am nowhere near fully masterworked. I'm only at around rank 6, 7, or 8 for some of them. Largely, I am also trying to save up for better pieces of gear with greater affixes to be able to really commit into them, such as with my Razor Plate, which I don't have any greater affixes on. But anyhow, this is my gear so far. This helm with Thorns and armor. The armor is a bit overkill. It is a greater affix. Cooldown reduction is good here. For my tempering, I have Blood Mist cooldown reduction, Skeletal Warrior Thorns, and then I've moved Hardened Bones over to my helm. It used to be on my amulet, but since I'm now using Unyielding Commander here, I've moved it onto my helm. And the damage reduction's still been okay. And again, for the bosses, you're getting one shot in a lot of cases anyway, so the damage reduction doesn't matter that much for the bosses. Moving on, of course, Razor Plate, standard stuff for a Thorns build, and the main source of your Thorns. Gloves, I have Frenzied Dead, again very standard for minion build, attack speed, crit chance, lucky hit chance. I'm actually looking to test out Skeletal Mages, so I am highly considering, once I get gloves with some greater affixes, I'll try to fix some Skeletal Mage Mastery onto my gloves. And then going back to my helm as well, I'm looking to try out Skeletal Warrior Mastery here as well. And some people have said that Skeletal Warrior Mastery actually scales with Thorns, or makes your Thorns scale up, so that might be very interesting too. So those are just a couple of things that I'm still looking for. For my pants, again, it's Explosive Mist. For the affixes, it's int, max life, resist all. You might not need to resist all, but this actually helps me round out all my resistances, so it's kind of dependent on what rings you have, what resistances you have on your rings and whatnot, and what you actually need. Blood Mist duration here, which may or may not actually be needed, but Decrepify size is nice. Perhaps the Blood Mist duration can be replaced with another Thorns affix. And then for my boots, it's Occult Dominion. This is actually unchanged from last time. Movement speed rolls, greater affixes, life and max life, and a minion Thorns affix. Onto my amulet, this is also unchanged from last time, although I did upgrade it a couple of times. I have ultimate cooldown reduction and damage to cursed enemies as my tempering, and fueled by death as my passive here, but fueled by death might not be the best here. Usually you'll probably want to get Hellbent Commander instead. Onwards to my ring, Needle Flare, attack speed, crit chance, chance to make enemies vulnerable for a bit more consistent vulnerable aside from my Bone Golem, and since I'm not running Corpse Tendrils. I have Golem active cooldown reduction. This can also be ultimate cooldown reduction, but I feel like for now, especially with my Reapers, my cooldowns have been very good and well balanced between Golem and my ultimate. And by the way, I'm also not running Hulking aspect, I forgot to mention that. Since I moved Hardened Bones over to my Helm, I've replaced my Hulking aspect with this, and I've pretty much had no problems with my Golem cooldown anyway, especially since I'm not running Blood Golem, so I don't really need to spam it as much for like bossing necessarily for burst damage. By the way, when you use the Bone Golem on a boss, it actually staggers them, so it could still be good, but I don't think it'll be better than Hardened Bones. Anyhow, for my last ring, I have Int, attack speed, lucky hit chance, or one of these can be crit chance. I have ultimate cooldown reduction and damage to curse, and then reanimation aspect, which again is very standard. I'm just going through the general gameplay and rotation of this build really quick, and assuming we're kind of trying to speed farm pit level 75, I'm going to show you how the rotation essentially works. So you want to just Decrepify, and you might not want to stand as forward as I am, but this is just for demonstration's sake, but use Decrepify, use your taunt, and then use blight maybe a couple times, and then do your blood mist to go in, and most of your enemies should die. If not, your taunt will be ready by then, and after your taunt's done, your blood mist will also be ready. So you really just need to rinse and repeat, and also be very safe, and you'll also just be really safe going through the run. And again, do keep trying to heal up your minions, and also pay attention to the buffs that you have here, right? There is a Flesh Eater Paragon node that you'll be able to see, which is whenever you consume 5 corpses, you gain 40% multiplicative damage. So you want to pay close attention to this counter here. When it gets close to 5, you want to also line it up with your Shadow Blight counter, right? So as you can see, the Shadow Blight counter is here, the blue one, and especially when you use your Corpse Explosion or your Blood Mist, and also your Blights, when it gets to a pretty high number, and this is especially true of bosses, when it gets to the proc, you also want to spam your Skeletal Priest if you haven't procced the Corpse Flesh Eater passive just yet, to get both to happen at the same time. And then you can just spam whatever other skills you can, right? Such as if you have Army of the Dead, that's yet another thing that you can stack on top of both buffs. So that's kind of how people have been dealing ridiculous damage with the Blood Golem specifically, but that sort of strategy kind of works with this build as well. And I'm also looking to get some Skeletal Mage Mastery to maybe get a bit more single target damage on my mage. On the bosses, the rotation is generally as follows. You want to lead with Blight, as well as Decrepify, and I usually taunt first and then go in for a Blood Mist. And then you again want to pay very close attention to the stacks of your buffs. Once you hit all the stacks that you need, namely your Corpse Eater, your Flesh Eater, and also your Shadow Blight, you want to pop Army of the Dead, and then just go ham. Perhaps use Blood Mist again to trigger your Corpse Explosions and spam your Golem activation. You're essentially just stacking everything, and of course also use Raised Skeletons, yet another multiplicative buff that you can stack on top of all that. You just want to make sure everything's sort of stacking at the same time, and you should be able to burst the boss down, especially if you have Holy Bolts active. And that's my current update on the Thorns Minions Necromancer. I'm definitely going to keep trying to improve this build. Of course, I still have a lot of master working to go, lots of greater affixes to hunt for. I'm going to try to buy a much better razor blade, of course, with some greater affixes. And maybe there are some other ways that I can tweak the build as well as I learn more. But in terms of pure pit pushing, I'm kind of losing a bit of motivation to do that because I'm sort of at the point, nearly at tier 100, where I kind of have to rely on cheese to kill the boss, especially with how the pits are sort of balanced towards or biased towards the bosses being much more punishing than the actual run itself. And sort of thus players having to rely on either playing perfectly and not being hit by any mechanics, or having to use some kind of cheesy burst, right? I feel like if I keep going down that route, I'm just gonna be kind of bored and be sort of pigeonholed into this sort of unfun strategy in my opinion. So with that, not only again will I be trying to improve my character more, but I'll also be looking out if Blizzard sort of rebalances the pit in a different way, especially with a supposed upcoming mid-season patch. And even if the pit doesn't really get rebalanced, I'm still fairly happy with how the Thorns minions has performed so far, since I am still able to farm the best mats with relative ease, even if I'm not necessarily able to push to the absolute highest levels with this build. At the end of the day, we're just having fun. And I might even start playing some of the other classes or trying out different builds too, so stay tuned for that. But again, my journey with the Thorns Necromancer is far from over. If I do make any more significant breakthroughs or discoveries, I'll be sure to put out a video on that as well. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below if you have any comments or suggestions, and I'll definitely reply to your comments as well. And so with that, I will catch you in the next video. Peace.